round of applause, please.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. And welcome, everyone. So pleased you're all here. Thank you for coming. I hope you enjoyed the two talks earlier this morning, and I hope I can continue to help educate and hopefully stir your interest. The cruise director is correct. I mean, it's really hard to figure out what you're going to talk about, because you can't really talk about the history of the Atlantic Ocean, although I guess if we were geologists or other forms of expertise, you probably do have enough to talk about. But we're going to talk today, even though we've already been to the Canary Islands, Spain, we'll talk a little bit about Spanish civilization and how the Spanish conquered the Canary Islands. The next lecture I'm going to do is the same concept. We'll talk about Portugal, which was the real leading edge in how Western civilization, sort of discovered the rest of the world, and then how they discovered and conquered Madeira. The third lecture I'm going to bring is one of Christopher Columbus, the original path to the New World, and how that sort of changed our whole existence. And we'll talk in the fourth lecture about globalization, because once Columbus had done that, they have something called the Columbian Exchange, the exchange of goods, services, plants, animals, and of course diseases between the old and new world. And then the last two lectures that I'll do are much more modern. One is just 80 years ago, because we'll talk about one of the major things that did happen in the Atlantic Ocean, and that was the Battle of the Atlantic Ocean, and that's during World War II, from the Royal Navy from Britain, us joining in the U.S., against the U-boats of Nazi Germany. And the last lecture I'll give is one that is probably much more pertinent to most of us, and that's how ocean liners evolved, if you wish, very gradually but quickly into cruise ships, and the difference between what is an ocean liner and what is a cruise ship. And we'll talk about that. There's only one ocean liner left going the seas right now. Anyone guess? Queen Mary II, exactly right. It's the only ocean liner on a schedule that's going back and forth. The rest are all cruise ships. The trip is the vacation, not getting somewhere. Anyway, okay, let's talk a little bit about the Canary Islands and the history of their conquering Spain. This is just for your edification, so that you know that I'm not someone that they picked up off the street. I have both a PhD and a law degree from Columbia, and the PhD was in European history. I lived in Paris for years, studied at Oxford, studied in Germany, and but decided that wasn't going to be my career. And I went back to Columbia, got the law degree, and now don't boo, became a Wall Street lawyer. Keep it quiet. But anyway, then into corporate law with Unilever and some other corporations, and did a lot of international travel. I had an office in Brussels in addition to the U.S., and traveled around a lot as a delegate to the World Trade Conferences, went to the UN Sustainable Development Conferences, and did a lot of exciting stuff. We were on the go all the time. And so this is my retirement gig. And it's designed to keep me traveling, but it's also more designed, and I'm sure a lot of you could give me some great advice on this, it's designed to hopefully keep the brain cells active in some ways, because I have to do some research on where we're going in depth, as opposed to my normal routine. So, and history is something that's accessible to all of you and all of us. It takes no special skills. As long as you can read, you can do history. And what I loved about history was the opposite of what probably a lot of other people like. If you read fiction, if you read a novel, the novel has to be believable. The plot line has to be somewhat believable. Otherwise, you're just going to say, wait a minute, this is crazy. I'm not going to read this. history doesn't have to be believable because it happened. And you'll be amazed. The stories in history are really amazing. And that's what I enjoy so much, is finding out about all of that. So anyway, we just visited the Canaries and Madeira. Today we'll talk about Spain in general and how they got to that point. Spain, of course, owns the Canary Islands, as does Portugal own Madeira. So let's go back a little bit earlier just to get an idea. And that's, Spain is unique in some ways. It was the only country in Europe that was conquered by the Muslim Arab forces. And this map shows the spread of Muslim religion after Muhammad's death in 632. I'm going to mention one other thing just to give you some background. You all know BC and AD, and it's the terminology we've been using for years to describe when and where things happened. America, or historians and archaeologists, have now changed that terminology. So you'll still see BC and AD used all over the place, but so that you're not confused, instead of AD, Anno Domini, Year of Our Lord, they've changed it now to CE. And CE means Common Era. And that still starts at 0. It's still the same period of time, but it's called the Common Era. So it doesn't have any religious significance. And so before the Common Era is very simple, BCE. Before the Common Era. And that's all the BC years. And so when you see that, don't get confused. BCE means, in the old terminology, BC, and AD now is CE. So anyway, this map shows the spread of Islam after Muhammad's death in 632, and you can see that they started to conquer a lot of areas of Asia, Africa, etc., the Middle East. And the orange is the spread, and of course, the real spread for us is into Iberia, the province of Iberia. And the Muslims were able to cross the Straits of Gibraltar, which wasn't called that then, and the man's name was Tariq, and Tariq crossed in 711 CE. 711 CE, he crossed the straits with teams of Berbers, and they created, in a sense, this thing called Gibraltar. And Gibraltar just means Mountains of Tariq, the guy's name who led the troops across. And it's down at the bottom of the map. You can see crossing from what was now Morocco, Africa, into the Iberian Peninsula. It took 7 years for the Muslims to conquer all of Spain, and they created what we call, or they called, Al-Andalus. And you can see that almost the whole Iberian Peninsula was, the Arab Muslim provinces. They ruled it between 711 and 1492. I think we'll all remember the last date, 1492. They ruled it for, 700 years. My goodness gracious. And it was a golden age in some ways, because a lot of Europe after the fall of the Roman Empire was not really in a dark age, but the learning and the rest wasn't as important as it used to be. And so science and the rest was something that the dark ages in the Western Europe wasn't really followed much, but the Muslims did. And they were able to keep the Greek texts viable. And there were major advances in trigonometry, astronomy, surgery, etc. And they were responsible, and it became, in a sense, a major educational center for medieval Europe. However, obviously, the inhabitants, the original inhabitants, did not like being ruled. They were all Christian, Roman Catholic. They didn't like being ruled by Muslims. And so we have something called the Reconquista in Spanish, meaning they wanted to reconquer Spain and evict the Arabs. And you can see this is a chart that starts at the top where they were starting the Reconquista, and the bands are going to the south, and this is how they conquered it. We don't need to go into depth on this because we really want to get to the Canary Islands. And so the last area is that purple area down at the bottom, which is Granada, and that's the last area that the Muslims controlled. And it took from the 8th century to 1492 for the Spaniards to reconquer Spain from the Muslims. There was some peaceful coexistence at time, and there was some cooperation between the Christian kingdoms and the Muslim, but mainly it was war at all costs. So we get to more modern Spain, and we have Queen Isabella of Castile and King Ferdinand of Aragon, and they were able to join forces. How did they do that? Through marriage. And their joint rule, in a sense, marks the de facto unification of Spain. Now, there's a little interesting story about that, too. She was 18 years old, and Ferdinand was 17 years old. They were second cousins. And as a result of that, they needed the Pope's dispensation to marry. But Pope Paul II refused to grant that dispensation. So what did Isabella and Ferdinand do? They made up their own documentation and married as a result of that. And so as a result, it was very interesting. They kept their kingdoms separate until 1707 through 1716, when they finally unified totally, and we get what we know as modern Spain. Now, this is the Reconquest, the Christians versus the Moors, and as you can see, the last brown a color on the Spanish or Iberian Peninsula is Granada, and that was when they finally, in 1492, they were finally able to liberate all of Spain, and that was quite a important date for many reasons. And we'll get to that 2 lectures from now when I also talk about Columbus, of course. Now, this is really the time of the Renaissance in Europe, from the 15th to 17th centuries. And there was a lot of encouragement of study of the planet, the oceans, etc. And there was a lot of human migration. It's a very compelling story. The Atlantic world story is dominated by humans pitted against the sea, if you wish, the natural eagerness to explore. And the Atlantic Ocean was an unknown quantity to most of them. The people had sailed out of the Straits of Gibraltar a little bit, but it was called the Sea of Darkness because they didn't understand it, and that's what the name of the ocean was. And only through a knowledge of the ways that this Atlantic Ocean was conquered can we really fully comprehend our own history, because our own history is so dependent on this action, this ability to see the world and conquer it to some extent. Now, these Renaissance voyages of discovery, and I can't impress this upon you more strongly, this is one of history's second or third most important phenomenon in terms of the effect on the modern world. And so from 1460 to about 1420 to 1620, the urge to find new lands increased, knowledge about our planet doubled, tripled, whatever, and it led to colonization, settlement, new wealth opportunities, and of course the creation of new nations. This is the period of the time of the Renaissance. Now you might ask, why did the initiative come from Western Europe? instead of the more advanced civilizations that existed at the time. And those were in China, India, or Japan. And, there's a lot of reasons. One of the things is Marco Polo's travels, which were documented, encouraged explorers. But eventually the government and the merchants were the ones that really organized exploration, not individual globetrotting. Now, we also had, of course, to deal with the indigenous populations, because we didn't quite discover the New World. Discovery is a misnomer because there are people living in the New World, inhabitants already, the indigenous natives. So we didn't technically discover it, but we discovered it for the Western world, Europe, which didn't know it existed. Europe needed precious metals, they needed spices. So the strategy, first, you had to conquer the territory and convert the indigenous peoples. Once you got them under control, you could justify your taking over the indigenous people because, in some sense, you were converting the heathen. These people were not believers in the quote-unquote true religion, and so this became a divinely inspired mission, a manifest destiny to convert the infidel, and that was part of their justification for why they did this. Before Columbus's voyages, Spain was blocked from gaining any of that really lucrative Asian trade since the Portuguese dominated the African routes. And we're going to talk in depth my next lecture about how Portugal did that and where it opened up new trade routes and new worlds. And Prince Henry the Navigator is going to be a major portion of that discussion. Now, we also have new ships at this time, and this is the ship that you might see, you'll see in some museums, and it's called the Caravel. It was available to Spain. The Portuguese really invented it, but it was available to Spain, and it allowed them to explore beyond the coastal areas. They had square sails, and square sails had been used in Northern Europe, and they combined that now with galleys, where people would still row, or other things that allowed these ships to go up the coastline. It was a shallow ship, shallow draft, so it could get up rivers and lakes. It was also gave the ability, these ships became armed. They had guns in the foreaft, the aft, and broadside. And these European guns were very, very effective. And we also have very ambitious captains, skilled crewmen available, and the need for material goods and possessions and the advanced technology that the Europeans had as opposed to the Africans and others, explain why the Europeans were able to launch this age of exploration. And just a word about this, the seamen, why would the seamen get on these ships? Because life at sea was extremely dangerous. And even with these improved ships, many, if not most sailors, died at sea. But you have to understand the era. The life expectancy at this time for most people was only in their 30s. So even on land, your life was hard, very uncertain, and for these sailors, hazards of exploration were not much more different than ordinary life experiences they would have had back on the farm or back, trying to eke out a living in some places. So, you think, boy, crazy to get on a ship and be risking your life, but they had very little choice anyway, and they had the possibility of great adventures, but great riches to them too. Now, let's go to the Canary Islands. As you can see from this map, the Canary Islands are very close to Africa, but Africa, as I mentioned, didn't develop strong seafaring, capabilities. And in fact, the Canaries were discovered by explorers from much further away in Europe. And in fact, the first person to step on the land from the west, from Europe in 1312, was from Genoa. Genoa and Venice were the two major seaports from Italy and the two major seafaring populations. 30 years later, a Portuguese expedition with a mixed crew landed there. They mapped the 13 islands and they identified the indigenous tribes of the islands. Here we go. The early adventurers had reported that there were riches to be had and that the Canary Islands were very easy to conquer. Europeans were then interested in possible slaves, but also converts to Christianity. So more expeditions excuse me, and conquering over the years started. Portugal was very interested in Lanzarote, the island we were there yesterday, and Castile was much more interested in Gran Canaria, the island we had on Monday. The Crown of Castile eventually conquered all the islands between 1402 and 1496, the last being Tenerife. Now, just an incidental thing, the Canary Islands may have been visited much earlier by the Phoenicians, which is the map on the right, and the Greeks on the map on the left. The Romans are credited with discovering the islands for the Western world, though, and identifying them, and they called them the Isla Canarias, which means in Latin islands of the dogs. And we don't know if they meant sea dogs or monk seals or whatever. And contrary to what most of you all probably think we know, canary birds were named after the island. They were not the reason we named these islands Canaries. That was the dogs from the Romans. Now, there were inhabitants. The Guanches were indigenous tribes. They were living on the Canaries for at least 2,000 years. They shared a common origin with the Berbers from North Africa coast, and they lived in natural caves with rich archaeological culture. There was ceramics, human sculptures. They fished, hunt, farmed, as well as painted their caves. But they were fairly culturally advanced, artistically advanced. The initial invasions by the Europeans were brutal, however, with military clashes with these indigenous people, formidable resistance from them, but they were ultimately, they couldn't compete with superior European arms and forces. And after the conquest, they were recruited for farming and labor for the West, especially when they started a single crop cultivation. The first major crop was sugarcane, and then eventually it became wine. And Las Palmas, the island we visited first, was the largest of the Canaries and became very important. It was a trading post for produce, and later it became the stopping point for the conquistadors and the missionaries on their ways to the New World. So let's take a quick look. Sugar industry, very wealthy and very profitable. But you needed a large labor force to be able to raise the sugar, etc. And sugarcane wealth made these islands actually rich attractive targets for others. So we do have pirates, we do have other nations getting involved, etc. And eventually, the competition from the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean drew the people away from it to go to the Caribbean, and sugar stopped being the main crop of the islands. Spain, though, also introduced some winery and bananas. Bananas was another major trade element that they could do. And the wealth allowed them to build great palaces, churches, etc. Now, we learned yesterday in our trip to Lanzarote that the sugar cane was actually not primarily used to produce real sugar, but to create, get this, alcoholic beverages. So as a result, this island wealth was often targeted by pirates, privateers, other European nations. Let's get to the modern era. We get to the modern era. As a colony of Spain, things continued pretty much the same for years after 1492, etc. As we move into the modern era, though, we've got to talk just a second about Franco. He was in office from 1938 to 1975, and he was ruling as dictator of Spain. He was a Spanish military general who overthrew what was then the Second Spanish Republic during the Spanish Civil War. And he had received support from Hitler and Mussolini during that Civil War. But he stayed out of World War II. He stayed neutral. But he did have a pro-Axis, Axis meaning Germany and Italy, stance, allowing Spanish soldiers to volunteer to fight in the German army against the Soviet Union, but not the Western Allies. And after the war, after the Axis died, the Spanish government tried to destroy all evidence of their cooperation with the Axis powers. And Franco, of course, set up concentration camps to imprison those disloyal to him. You know, not a very nice guy, and not a great time to be living in Spain. Let's go to the Canary Islands, since we know something about those. In the modern era, i.e. the 19th and 20th centuries, much immigration occurred to the Canary Islands. And of course, some of the Canary Islands people decided that they were going to get much better success if they moved to the Spanish colonies in the Caribbean, as I talked about with sugar, and they did. And in fact, when we go to Puerto Rico, there's a tradition such as the Mascaras Festival, and it occurs in Hatillo. And that's an example of Canarian culture that's still being preserved today. And today, of course, Canary Islands have great beaches, great tourism. There is 12 million visitors a year, including us. And the economy now is based not on sugar, not on wine. It's based primarily on tourism. 32% of the GDP of the Canary Islands is tourism. And they're building condos, they're building second vacation homes, et cetera, all through the islands, to say the least. Canary Islands are the only autonomous, meaning self-ruling community in Spain. And there's two capitals. One is one we visited, Las Palmas, and the other is in Tarife, the Santa Cruz to Tarife. Let's talk about the geology of these islands for a second, because this is a place where, if this lecture was occurring 5 years ago, I'd be able to scare the life out of most of you. How many people live on the East Coast of the United States? Yes, so do we. We were going to be at real risk because of the Canary Islands. The geology is fascinating. They're a string of volcanoes about 280 miles long, not dissimilar to the Hawaiian chain of volcanoes, the Hawaiian Islands that peak up above the waterline. The volcanic history of the Canary Islands started about 70 million years ago, and it's occurred a lot in the last 11,700 years on all of the main islands except one. And these islands are still volcanically active. Indeed, in fact, the plate tectonics of both the Canaries and of Madeira are impacted by the major fault line. If you see that fault line going through the Azores, etc. And it's probably accounts for some of the instability in the the prolific earthquakes that are occurring all the time, little minor ones, but earthquakes falling all the time in both the Madeira area and the Canary Islands, to say the least. The top news is that in the fall of 2021, when we center on Canary Islands, especially La Palma, we have a significant volcanic eruption. And this is where it is on La Palma, and there's La Palma there. This volcanic eruption was fairly significant. As the lava flows approached the ocean, residents all around the area were luckily evacuated, and not just because of the lava, because once the lava flow hit the oceans, the water, it creates a chemical reaction and explosions that release toxic gases into the air. And some earthquakes were obviously also triggered. And from the last news from this thing, there were luckily no major injuries or fatalities, fortunately. But it did, people lost a lot of homes, they had to be evacuated, and it lasted from September 19th to December 13th, 2021. And the lava flow on that west side of the island destroyed more than 3,000 buildings, 7,000 people were evacuated, and my wife and I, Lynn and I, had the great opportunity. We were on a cruise ship at that time. I don't know if it was going back transatlantic, but we were on a cruise ship. Was it going transatlantic? I couldn't remember. Yep. And we were on, and the captain was able to get permission to sail close to La Palma, Las Palmas in the Gran Canary Island. And we did that. We were there in October of 21. About a month after the eruption began. And we were able to watch the flow. This is a picture taken by a friend of ours on the ship itself. And this is what we could see. We can see the flow coming down. And if you look at this picture, you'll see this is how far the lava flow covered. That's why 7,000, homes were 3,000 homes, 7,000 people, I forgot which. But anyway, but here you can really see how the flow creates a new peninsula. It just comes in, and the lava, the balsamic rock, just covers the sea, and you get new land. That's what it's creating, new land. And you can see that very easily there. This is a recent photo of the volcanic caldera, and you notice how quickly vegetation has regrown over the last 3 years, to say the least. Now, that recent eruption on La Palma stimulated speculation, because up to 5 years ago, at the most, there was a real fear that the volcanic flank of the island was built on a fault. There was a fault line, and when the volcano would occur, the fear is that that fault line would be activated and the western part of the island would slide into the Atlantic Ocean. Now, that would have created a tsunami that would devastate, as you can see from this map, the east coast of the North and South America, and even be worse for Africa. The analysis and speculations have indicated that there was the potential for waves of more than 300 feet. And so you can imagine if you're standing on land and you have a wave of 300 feet coming at you, you don't have very many choices left. This map actually also indicates that the waves coming into the U.S. could possibly be as large as 130 to 160 feet high, moving at a speed of 650 miles an hour, and it would travel at least 12 and a half miles inland. So if you live on the coast, New York City would have tremendous floods and probably be pretty impossible to reoccupy right away. And of course, my wife and I, we live now permanently in Florida, in Palm Beach, on the barrier island. And the barrier island was flat. You know, if it's 10 feet above sea level or 15 at the most, that's it. Our whole island would be underwater and would be gone. So it's really pretty frightening. Now, that was all based on the beliefs that the fault line was going to be wrecked and the tsunami would occur. The U.S. Geological Survey, just a few years ago, with much more updated data and technology methods, questions that risk. And would it have been as great as it was predicted beforehand? Previous eruptions in 1949 and 1971 showed that slope stability is actually pretty stable in Canary Islands, and there's been no increase in earthquakes, which would be expected to accompany that side of collapse. So with these current data flows and prediction techniques, it's believed now by the U.S. Geologic Survey that a more likely scenario for the U.S. would be a wave of no more than 3 to 7 feet. So still hazardous, but very similar to a strong storm surge, nothing very serious. And so as a result, whereas I can't scare you all to death and get you all excited about this possibility on the East Coast, at least the latest technology and the latest expertise says, you know, it's not going to happen the way they predicted before. I hope that's true, at least in my lifetime, because it would be devastating to the east coast of the U.S. and to the east coast of South America, say the least. It's the same thing. And you can see how quickly they predict, and these wave predictions of how fast the waves will get to you are correct. I mean, it'll be like 8 hours after the tsunami, it'll get to the east coast. So you won't have much time to do much. But if it's only 3 to 7 feet, yeah, I think that's one that we normally can handle. So with that, you know, I can't scare you enough, but the Canary Islands are a fascinating place, and they're obviously very prone now to major tourism. So on that positive note, we'll end this presentation on Spain and the Canary Islands. I want to thank you for attending. I do want to give you a small plug. This is a book that I recently published because during pandemic we couldn't travel. So I sat down and wrote 90,000 words, and it's just a personal travel memoir. It's available, there's a few copies available in the ship store. And if you pick one up this week there, I will be happy to sign it for you. But you can always get it if at the end of the day you want one and you want it, you can always get it on Amazon. My next presentation will be on Madeira and Portugal and how Portugal led the way in the Western world discovery. I hope to see you all then. After that, we're going to talk about Christopher Columbus. And there's a lot of interesting information about Christopher Columbus that, you know, I didn't get in my high school history courses at all. But that's typical that they would keep some of that away. And how his trade that he launched between the old and the new worlds changed the history of the world. And that's when we'll talk about globalization, because the Western world in the Atlantic was really the key to that making the world global, making the world something that we all could you know, visit, buy from, etc., etc. So it's really a pretty good analysis of that. And with that, I thank you all very much for coming.